Hello, you're right. Welcome back to this week's podcast. We are looking at Victorian context because you'll be studying Sherlock Holmes, the Speckled Band. I am here with
Miss Thornhill.
Miss Green.
and Miss Hussein. So let's start off with looking at the author. Miss Thornhill, do you want to start?
Yeah, so Arthur Conan Doyle was the author who created the character of Sherlock Holmes. I think it's important to consider before we start looking at the story is that Arthur Conan Doyle was born in 1859 in Edinburgh. That was the same year that Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species, which cast doubt on the existence of God. And at this time in history, that caused a great deal of turmoil for people because everything they'd known up until now, they were being told that it was wrong. So Arthur Conan Doyle himself would have grown up with this theory in his mind, so he would have been interested in science and religion. And when he grew up and left school, he studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where he met a man called Richard Bell. And Richard Bell is the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes because Richard Bell, he was a forensic scientist and he had really amazing observational skills, powers of deduction and inference, as does Sherlock Holmes.
Okay, so at that time there was a lot of mistrust in the police. Why do you think there was this mistrust in the police?
I think a lot of cases went unsolved. So there's a specific story that Miss Thornhill, you told me before about.
Yeah, so there was a serial killer, Jack the Ripper, who was around at that time. He killed, I think, 5 women that we know about. And a lot of people were scared to go out on their own, especially women, because of this killer. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle and his friend Richard Bell, who I've mentioned before, both got together and they solved the mystery of Jack the Ripper, apparently. Both of them went to the crime scenes, they studied the crime scenes, they spoke to police, they spoke to witnesses, and they both came up with a name of who they thought it might be. They each wrote down the name, put it into an envelope, swapped envelopes, and both of them had the same name in the envelope. Now, when they took all this evidence to the police kind of just swept it under the carpet. They weren't interested. One reason for that is probably because the suspect was a tutor to Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband.
Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria is really important because this was set in the Victorian era. And when you start reading the story, you'll notice at the beginning Helen Stoner is quite similar to Queen Victoria in especially with her dress sense.
Yeah, because she's dressed in black, isn't she? Which symbolises the fact that she is in mourning, as was Queen Victoria.
And so, if you might already know this, but Queen Victoria just swore to wear black after her husband died. So it was she was showing how she's going to be mourning his death now for the rest of her life.
Also, what else links in with the story is that Queen Victoria had manservants, as they were called then, but they were Hindu manservants, so we've got that link with imperialism, which we can see in the story of the Speckled Band. India features quite a lot in the story, and at that time in England, England was a country that was going around and colonising different countries. It was exerting its power all over the world, and they actually referred to India as the jewel in the crown.
So it's really exotic, and you'll notice when you are reading, there's a lot of references to India and the animals in India,
and the culture and the way that they sort of used animals.
Yes.
Differently. For example, the snake charmer.
Yeah, and that's going to play a big part in the story. So we've already looked at the mistrust with the police, and what I want to do now is look at how this links to our story that we're going to be reading.
And the specific characters.
Yeah, and characters it can link to.
Okay, so Helen Stoner is interesting and unusual because she doesn't go to the police with her problem. She goes directly to Sherlock Holmes. One of the reasons for this is because there was a distrust in the police at that time. People, as we've already said, were feeling scared. They didn't feel that crimes were being solved. So because she desperately is seeking answers, she wants to find out what's happened, she goes straight to him. She just bypasses the police completely. I mean, another reason might be that because she's a woman, if she'd have gone to the police may have gone over her head and went to speak to her uncle, who is the prime suspect in the murder. So, yeah, she would have been bringing suspicion on herself, and she would have been putting herself in danger.
And that's because of the hierarchy that was in place during the Victorian era, wasn't it?
Yeah, so women weren't
Seems to be
really...
beneath men, and
They were second-class citizens as well. I mean, it had gotten better, but women weren't financially independent. Women didn't go out to work, rarely.
perhaps the police wouldn't have believed her.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So they may have believed her uncle, and the suspicious death that we learn about at the start of the story may not have been investigated.
Yep.
Look at crime in the Victorian era now. Now, people seem to think that murder was the most common crime, but it wasn't. It was actually theft. And the reason why theft was the most common crime is because there was a big divide and a lot of poverty, a big divide between rich and poor. So there was a lot of pickpockets and a lot of petty thefts and things like that. So when a murder happens, people became quite obsessed. They had like a macabre fascination with death and with murder. And that's what helped these books to sell, because they had murders in them.
Mm-hmm. And Sherlock Holmes was really popular at the time because of his descriptions of
His
murder
methods,
scenes and his methods. They found that really, really interesting, didn't they?
Yeah, the more gory, the more fascinated they became, because it was something that didn't happen very often.
Yeah, there were quite unusual murders in Sherlock Holmes as well. So we've talked about imperialism and the influence that India had on him, because the deaths in this story are taken from Indian culture. Which would have been unusual.
Yeah. Would you say that it's a form of his stories are a form of escapism, or more of a hyper reality for the time?
Probably a bit of both, really. Probably a bit of escapism, because if you think up until now, a large proportion of the population was still illiterate. So reading would have been a form of entertainment. So one person would have read the stories to, say, the rest of the family or the community. These books were actually serialised weekly in a newspaper, so it would have been like watching a soap now. You would read a chapter and then you would have to wait a week to find out what happens next. So it would have been like a big deal.
Yeah, I'd say it's a mixture of
Anticipation.
Yeah. So we are going to conclude it there, because I think we've covered quite a lot of Victorian context now, and it was really important that you were listening, because on your PowerPoint there should be some questions that you need to answer, so you should have been actively listening. So yes, thank you, Year 8, and I shall